Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to be telling you about mostly white dwarf asteroseismology. In this talk, the first half of the talk, I'm going to tell you some of the things we've learned in the era of precise space-based photometry with Kepler and K2. And then the second half of the talk, I'm going to talk about some more recent tools and methods that we've been using to make sense of test data on pulsating white dwarf stars and some future ideas for how I think where this field can go. So I'm a new faculty member at Queens College. So I just want to advertise some of the students that I've been working with. I've really been building up a group of researchers. I'm really excited to be working on problems related to asteroseismology, mostly of white dwarf stars. Asteroseismology is the study of the pulsations of stars to interpret their properties, particularly their interior structure properties. Also looking for exoplanets around white dwarfs, and focusing on developing better methods and software for doing these types of analyses. So for those of you who don't think about white dwarf stars every day, typical white dwarf, thinking about 0.6 solar masses compressed into an object about the size of the Earth. Their interior structures are supported by electron degeneracy pressure. Most white dwarfs have a composition of carbon and oxygen in the core with thin layers of helium, and most with an even thinner layer of hydrogen, stratified layers with these compositions on the outside, talking about like 1% by mass of helium and 1/1000th by mass of hydrogen. Let's see, so there's two main reasons that I'm interested in studying white dwarf stars. One is the extreme compression of matter that's present in these extraterrestrial laboratories. We can study the physics of matter under these extreme compressions, but also white dwarf stars represent the final end stage of about 97% of stellar evolution in our galaxy. So we can study white dwarfs to understand what happens to stars in their final stages, the rapid stages of stellar evolution, and also what happens to the planetary systems that exist around most stars while their stars are going through these late phases of stellar evolution that involve large amounts of mass loss. So this talk will be focusing on asteroseismology, which is where standing wave oscillations of the stars allow us to probe the interior conditions of these objects. Pulsating stars resonate at a bunch of normal mode frequencies that are very sensitive to the structures of these objects, these physical objects. And the pulsations cause brightness variations that we can measure in precise time series photometry. And the analysis of those frequencies, we can compare to models to try to infer something about the interior structures of these stars. So here's just sort of an example of what pulsations might look like. This is not data. I've just generated this data set that includes 3 pulsations. What we typically do is we take a periodogram or a Fourier transform of the time series brightness variations that we have, and we detect in that periodogram that there are a few signals present with specific frequencies and specific amplitudes. Each of these frequencies corresponds to a resonant mode vibration of the object. What each of these signals individually represents are standing wave oscillations. These are spherical harmonic. These have the pattern of spherical harmonics on the surface. Here I show 3 different sinusoids. The little dot traces where we are in the phase of that pulsation. And each of these has a different spherical harmonic pattern associated with it. This one is in L is 1, M is 0 mode. L is 1 means the surface gets split into 2 different sectors, and these change with the M0 mode. It changes whether the top half or the bottom half is hot at this particular point in time, whereas the M does not equal 0 modes represent these traveling waves around the equator. And then this is an L2 mode that has 2 nodes on the surface that split this up into different sectors. So individually, when we look at a periodogram, each of the signals that we see corresponds to one type of oscillation that has this pattern on the surface and then has some different number of nodes in the radial direction. And from all of these different ways that a star can pulsate, we can try to map the interior structure in principle. All of these added together, happening at the same time in a star, we can combine these to show what this surface of the star must be doing to create all these signals. These are some great animations that Andrew in the crowd provided for me this morning, using some tools that we're developing for modeling stellar oscillations with the STARry framework that many of you are probably familiar with. STAR uses spherical harmonics to represent surface non-homogeneities, things like star spots on the surface of a star. And we thought, well, if you can represent the surface of the star as the sum of a bunch of spherical harmonics, like that's what I have in mind when I'm thinking about pulsations. So can't we use the same framework to show what is happening on a star while it pulsates? And there's a question in the back. Yeah, Julianne?
I just want to say I speak for everybody. These are really, really cool animations.
Yeah, well, these are all from Andrew,
I know,
and we're building up this framework not just to make pretty pictures that reproduce the data sets that we have, but we have in mind to then include the effect of an eclipsing binary around these systems. You've probably heard of how eclipsing binaries can like map the locations of star spots on stars. Each of these signals, these all produce sinusoids. And so you could get a sinusoid at a particular frequency that corresponds to any of these surface patterns. And it's one of the limitations of our current methodology. We often don't know, what is the nature of this signal? What is the L and M of its spherical harmonic mode? But if you had an eclipsing binary, the modulation to this amplitude while an eclipse is happening would be different in each of these three cases. And so STARry will be great for including the effect of eclipses to show, to give us constraints on what the spherical harmonics are of the individual modes, which really simplifies our comparison of our measured pulsation frequencies to the modeled pulsation frequencies in our stellar models. So this is a project we've just been working on this year, but it's heading in that direction. So white dwarf asteroseismology in particular, white dwarfs pulsate in a few particular regions of parameter space, here shown on the HR diagram, right? You got the main sequence, the star evolves off the main sequence. It goes through this planetary nebula phase, it loses a lot of mass, and then it cools. It evolves as white dwarfs evolve by cooling. They're just left with the residual energy from their previous lives, and they radiate away that energy over time. And as they cool, they pass through these instability strips where the conditions are just right for them to oscillate spontaneously. I focus mostly on stars in this DBV and DAV instability strip. The DBV strip is where white dwarfs with helium atmospheres pulsate, and the DAV instability strip is where white dwarfs with hydrogen atmospheres pulsate. This range of temperatures where this happens is where their outer layers become convective, and it's the convection zone that's able to absorb some energy and re-release it in such a way to amplify displacements that are occurring in these stars so that they build up large oscillation amplitudes. So the big goal here is to use these pulsations to sensitively map the conditions of the stellar interior. Things like the shape of the oxygen profile within the core, the locations and masses of the different layers, the hydrogen layer, the helium layer, the mixing length of the convection, these sorts of properties that our stellar models are sensitive to when we produce pulsation periods. We can see what the effect of turning all these different knobs looks like. And if we could turn the knobs just right to reproduce an observed data set, we may infer what the properties of those stars actually are. The typical pulsation periods for white dwarfs are sort of between 2 and 20 minutes. And so when we're interested in using space-based data to to observe these things from Kepler or TESS. We typically need the short cadence data with timescales of 1 or 2 minutes. TESS now has this ultra short cadence of 20 seconds, which is really nice, in order to resolve those signals. So Kepler was really a revolution for studying pulsating white dwarf stars because we got these long continuous light curves. It's really tricky. Most of the work prior to Kepler was using ground-based data where there were big gaps during the daytimes from single site observations. These produced all these aliases in the frequency analysis that made it unclear what the actual frequencies of variability were. There was some ambiguity about what those frequencies are. So I'm going to describe how we've accomplished these 3 main results using the Kepler and the K2 data, improving our understanding of why certain pulsation modes seem incredibly coherent, while other pulsation modes, even in the same stars, can be very incoherent, how we measure rotation rates using pulsation properties, and a new phenomenon that I discovered as part of my PhD thesis about pulsation-related outbursts. I'll describe what that means. The original Kepler mission focused on one particular patch of sky where we did not know of any pulsating white dwarfs when the Kepler mission started. And so there were some efforts to identify those once Kepler was running so we could get this great data set. But then when Kepler's second reaction wheel failed, it was forced to observe new fields along the ecliptic, which was great for pulsating white dwarf stars because we knew of a bunch of white dwarfs that fell into these fields, and we were able to get a lot of really rich data sets on these variable systems. So this is a plot that I made during my thesis. This is showing the Fourier transform of the first hydrogen atmosphere pulsating white dwarf star to be observed in the Kepler field of view. We got 1.5 years of data on this system, and it revealed a bunch of pulsation signals. Here in the low frequency range of the Fourier transform, the pulsation signals look like these wide bands of power, whereas at the high frequency range, these are really sharp features. And what this represents, the width of these features that we fit to the Fourier transform, the width represents how incoherent, how much these signals are varying in phase, frequency, or amplitude during the observations. Whereas a really sharp peak is pretty coherent during the time span of the observations. And these are both in the same star. This was the first time we really came to appreciate that a single pulsating white dwarf star can have both extremely coherent and very incoherent modes at the same time. Prior to Kepler, we had limited ground-based data sets for stars spanning the entire range of temperatures in the instability strip, and we thought that the hot pulsators were really coherent, while the cool pulsators were not. Here's a comparison of some of the Fourier transforms for different stars as a function of effective temperature as white dwarfs cool through the instability strip for hydrogen atmosphere pulsations. And you see that the hottest stars have high frequency pulsations that are very sharp and coherent, while as the cooler stars have more low frequency pulsations, which are quite incoherent. But these same stars can still have very sharp features at higher frequency. So we found out that it's less of a function of temperature than it is a function of the frequency of the individual modes, whether they're going to be coherent or incoherent. And I'll explain our understanding of this behavior shortly. But first, I want to talk a little bit about how we put these dots in this observational. This is like a spectroscopic HR diagram, sort of log G and effective temperature, which are measured from analyzing the Balmer line spectra of these white dwarfs. They have pretty much pure hydrogen atmospheres. We see these pressure broadened spectral lines, which we can fit atmosphere models to. And these shapes of these lines can tell us about the masses and effective temperatures of these objects, allowing us to place them in this diagram. However, there are a number of reasons to suspect that this type of analysis includes many sources of systematic error. Uh, the physics of these models, very sensitive to how the microphysics is being treated, and different prescriptions for the physics in these atmospheres can produce different results. And the models are constantly being improved in order to bring the observations into better agreement with what we expect white dwarfs to look like as a population. There's also become increasing focus on treating the surface of these stars as not just having a single spectrum. These pulsating white dwarfs have convective outer layers, so they have hot and dark regions on the surface, and that needs to be treated. And so people have been developing better methods for doing this for white dwarf stars. There have also been some laboratory astrophysics experiments at Sandia National Labs, led by my former group at UT Austin, where I did my PhD. They're simulating the physical conditions of white dwarf photospheres in the lab by irradiating gas cells with the strongest X-ray source on Earth that's located at Sandia National Labs, bringing them to the temperatures, the conditions of white dwarf photospheres, and measuring the shapes of the Balmer lines in order to compare to the models that we use to interpret the measured Balmer lines in white dwarf spectra. And they find discrepancies between the physical conditions that they understand to be of their gas cells compared to the line shapes that are produced by our best models under those conditions. And there's also a reason to understand that how the observations were taken and how they were reduced can greatly affect the results systematically. There's a really great PhD thesis from Josh Fuchs, where he compared a bunch of different approaches to measuring the spectra, measuring the spectroscopic log Gs and effective temperatures of the same white dwarfs with different instruments under different observing conditions, with different choices of like where to normalize the spectrum, what to treat as the continuum, and how to remove the continuum from the spectra, and showing that all of these decisions have a really direct effect on what the final values that you get out of that analysis are. So this is a great way to put stars probably in roughly the correct order of decreasing temperature, and roughly in the correct order of differing log G. But there is reason to suspect that there are significant systematics in these measurements. Is that a question? Yeah.
The discovery with a lab experiment, sort of how big is it? I'm just curious. Factors of 2 or?
Honestly, I don't know the answer to that very much. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure. It's something with the electron densities or something, but I've asked that same thing, and I don't know that they really understand the discrepancy quite yet. It could be an issue with the experiment, I think, at this point, but worth noting there. Okay, so looking back at this picture, this is how we've measured these properties, and we see how the typical pulsation spectra of white dwarfs vary through this range. We're going to kind of revisit this idea that we used to have about, well, it's that the hot white dwarfs have these really coherent modes, while the cool white dwarfs have very incoherent modes. Try to understand how stars can show both of these behaviors at the same time. So the old view of this was to kind of split the instability strip into hot stars and cool stars. And now I'm coloring the points on this plot based on the half width at half maximum of the Lorentzian profile that we fit to each signal in the Fourier transform against the period of that mode. And you see that probably the more profound difference is that the longer period modes have wider signatures in the Fourier transform, while the shorter period modes have narrower signatures closer to the frequency resolution of the data that look rather coherent during the observations. So that may be a more sensible way to split this down the middle here. Okay, maybe we could have moved this over a little bit. But roughly at 800 seconds seems to be where this divide is happening. If we wanted to round it to the nearest 100 seconds. But we can do better than this. This is very phenomenological. We can create some stellar models. I'm not going to go into great detail about how to read a propagation diagram. The important thing to know is that this is modeling the structure of a star from the center to the surface, and that the gravity mode pulsations that we observe in white dwarf stars are standing waves that resonate between these boundaries that I've colored in very crudely with a highlighter. So, for example, we could look at one star and we could say here at this frequency, the frequency is just right for a standing wave to propagate to meet the boundary conditions of a standing wave in this star. So there could be a 300-second mode in this star, a 1500-second mode here. This star, this represents, I don't have the temperature. Okay, I think it's on the next slide. Anyway, we're marking here this 800-second boundary where we see that the behavior really changes. And this corresponds to this point where the gravity modes change from propagating with shorter periods bound by this acoustic frequency to the longer period modes that are bound by the base of the convection zone, where the buoyancy frequency drops to 0. And so it could be that the difference here is based on the difference in the behavior of these two different types of boundaries with time. In particular, we know that white dwarf stars adjust the depths of their convection zones to the local temperature perturbations caused by pulsations on timescales of about 1 second compared to the timescales of the pulsations that are on the orders of minutes. So if you think about this spherical harmonic variation in temperature that I was showing earlier, that also causes a spherical harmonic variation in the depth of the convection zone locally within the white dwarf star. So if at some point on the white dwarf star, the temperature is increasing because of a pulsation, say it's decreasing because of a pulsation, the convection zone gets deeper, it moves this reflective boundary for the longer period modes. So these modes with longer periods are propagating in a region where they're being reflected off a moving boundary, and a boundary that's moving in a complicated way in response to a large number of pulsational oscillations that are happening within the star. So they're causing some sort of Doppler shift of the modes. The way that the boundary meets the pulsations is going to, in some cases, remove energy, in some cases, add energy to these modes. And that seems to explain pretty well why we see these modes with the red dashed lines that represent fairly incoherent signals below this period where the Lamb frequency crosses the Brun-Weissler frequency here. And we see coherent modes marked with blue at shorter periods. Now there is one red line for this particular star right here. We could understand that being incoherent if it's an L is 2 mode, because then it propagates out past this Lamb frequency for L is 1 modes out here to the convection zone, which could cause it to be incoherent. So I think this is a really clean description of why we see this type of behavior, this dichotomy of mode coherence in pulsating white dwarf stars. Here we use an alpha value for the mixing length theory that correctly sets for this set. This is like 27 pulsating white dwarf stars represented on this plot, all of the modes from all of those stars. Each one has a different effective temperature measured by spectroscopy. And we use this this alpha for the mixing length, and we see where that crossing period is for that particular star, and we color code them based on whether they're above or below the crossing period. And that can really reproduce pretty nicely the behavior that we're seeing, this dichotomy of coherence. So that's the first result that I wanted to share from the Kepler era. The next one's a little simpler. Ooh, my animations aren't working. Imagine these traveling waves around the equator like you saw before. -1 and +1 means they travel in opposite directions, right? When a pulsating star is rotating, the modes get split into multiplet components that are split by an amount that's proportional to the rotation frequency. And so here, this is what I showed before for the first hydrogen atmosphere white dwarf observed by Kepler. Up in the high frequency range here, we see this triplet of signals, which we interpret as corresponding to these 3 mode patterns. And the spacing between these components can give us the rotation period and asteroseismic rotation period. And doing that to a large number with a large number of stars allows us to measure things like the rotation period as a function of mass, showing that more massive pulsating white dwarf stars appear to be rotating faster. So this may be interesting for understanding the angular momentum evolution of these systems throughout the mass loss process. But the third thing that we discovered with Kepler was really unexpected, and this is what happens when you look at systems in new ways. We never had a data set like Kepler for a pulsating white dwarf star. I was handed this for my master's thesis project. Got this, what an incredible opportunity. The first year and a half, highly precise light curve of a pulsating white dwarf star. Just take the Fourier transform of it and measure the frequencies of the pulsations. When I looked at the light curve, I was surprised to see that instead of just little oscillations from the pulsational variations, there seemed to be these recurring brightness enhancements that kind of looked like flares. They happened at irregular times. There's not really a periodicity here. This is zooming in successively into these shaded regions. So you can see, like, during a week, there may be 3 of these increases in brightness that are significant. The noise is there's a lot of noise for this very faint pulsating white dwarf that was in the Kepler field, but the huge amount of data that we had allowed us to really measure the pulsation signals with great precision, and also to detect these brightness enhancements. And so this is what we called outbursts from pulsating white dwarfs, for lack of a better term. May not have been the best term. But this was the first example of it with this huge data set from Kepler. As Kepler started to observe new fields along the ecliptic as K2, we saw more examples of this from brighter white dwarfs where we could get much better signal and noise and really see what was going on. So this is a really dramatic example of another pulsating white dwarf that had increases in brightness up to 40% during the oscillations. And zooming in on the region of one of these outbursts, we can see that the oscillation signatures, which you can see here in quiescence, increase dramatically during the outburst. And so this convinced us that this is certainly something that's happening in these white dwarfs, which, let me tell you, when I was dealing with the Kepler data for the first time and no one else in my field had really looked at this before, I was like, this is probably like systematics or something. Like, I don't know what space-based data is supposed to look like. We became very much more comfortable that this is really something that occurs quite frequently in pulsating white dwarfs. And in fact, as we kept getting new fields observed, we found more examples of this. We're up to about 14 or 15 examples in the whole K2 data set by now. And we found that these all happen at the cool edge of the instability strip, which theoretically we don't have a great explanation for why we stop observing pulsations in white dwarfs at a certain temperature. We know why they start pulsating at a particular temperature because they get these outer convection zones, and the convection can drive the pulsations. But the models that we have say that they should continue to pulsate to cooler temperatures. And since this outburst behavior shows up and is able to really disrupt the pulsations, this may be the mechanism that kicks in and suppresses pulsations in these stars after they cool beyond a certain point. So these were the major results for Kepler analysis of pulsating white dwarf stars. You'll notice that I didn't include the precision constraints on the interior structures of these stars. There was actually a paper that was able to produce a fit within the precision of the measurements for the pulsation periods of a white dwarf. This was a Nature paper. It was a really huge paper in our field. This is like the cutting edge of white dwarf asteroseismology. They were able to create a stellar model that matched the pulsation periods to measurements of like a nanohertz precision. And in order to find a fit like that, it required that the oxygen content of the core be larger than stellar evolutionary models suggested they should be. And so a conclusion from this was, we've mapped the interior of this star so precisely that we need to revisit stellar evolution theory to produce cores that look like the cores that we're observing. And then the final line of this Nature paper says, when the Gaia data come out, they will test whether this result is reliable. That's paraphrasing. But when I looked at the Gaia data, they produced a constraint on the radius of this system that was like 6 sigma discrepant with the radius constraint from asteroseismology. So this is still the best result for the field of white dwarf asteroseismology that anyone's acquired. No one else has ever been able to reproduce the pulsation frequencies within their precisions, and therefore actually infer properties of the interior structure and assign uncertainties to those measurements, which allowed me to make this comparison. There was actually an error bar on the asteroseismic radius that I could compare to the uncertainty on the size of the star from Gaia. But we're not quite there yet for constraining the interior structures of these stars. Since I'm talking about Gaia, Gaia was huge for white dwarf stars. Because white dwarfs are the size of the Earth, they're intrinsically very faint. So the ones that we can observe at reasonable magnitudes, the kinds of ones that we can get good quality light curves from Kepler or TESS, they're necessarily very nearby. And so they have very large parallax signatures. Before Gaia, we knew mostly about white dwarf stars in the SDSS footprint. And most of those we knew from spectroscopy, from observing programs that were trying to target quasars, which are also blue. And so they accidentally observed a couple tens of thousands of white dwarf stars, which were wonderful, but an extremely biased sample because of the ones that look most like quasars. With Gaia now, there's been a tenfold increase in the number of white dwarf stars known, from about 30,000 before Gaia to now like 300,000 white dwarfs all over the sky. So white dwarfs are a great field to be in right now. We've just this huge increase in how many we know about and how many we're able to study. So I'm going to use the Gaia data to help constrain some fits later. Moving on to the second part of my talk, where we talk about how we analyze test data on white dwarf stars. So here I'm going to just pitch a little bit this Python package that I wrote for analyzing variable systems. This does a pre-whitening frequency analysis. This is a type of algorithm for determining what the frequencies are that are present in your data set. They take a periodogram, the test light curve. This is a noise-dominated light curve, but it's like 20 days long. So we can still, in the periodogram, pick out these signals that stand out way above the noise. We're able to pick out the pre-whitening algorithm. We pick out the highest signal and we fit that to the light curve. Now this looks like a big band of red because it's so high frequency, it's just coloring over itself across the light curve, but this is what it looks like in PyRid. We find the next signal that's present in the residuals, and we include that in our model, and we continue this way on and on until we get down to just the noise floor. Some of these signals, though, they are combination frequencies. They're caused by nonlinear responses of the star to the pulsations, and they're related to the independent pulsation modes by some simple arithmetic relationships, just integer multiples of the individual frequencies. So in this signal fitting code, PyRid made it so you can enforce these relationships so that as you fit these, the fits that you get here are always precisely the combinations of the individual modes, which gives us better results, physically motivated results. We continue this all the way down until we fit all the modes. And if I zoom in here on just one day of data, you can see what the model looks like underneath the noise. This is what we think the oscillations of this star look like. And you'll notice that these the upward peaks are a little bit higher than the downward peaks. That's the effects of these combination frequencies and harmonics. From doing Fourier series, you can represent something like a square wave as the sum of sinusoids with different harmonics. Some of these pulsations aren't strictly sinusoidal, and so these combination frequencies help capture that behavior. PyRid then reports the measured frequencies, amplitudes, and phases with uncertainties, showing which ones are combination frequencies. And you could fix any of these if you knew from external data what these values were. And it's really kind of a generic signal fitting code for time series data with coherent signals that are present. And you can check that out on GitHub if that sounds useful to you. Now, there's one more thing to be very careful about with test data, and that is that test data have huge pixels, 21 arc seconds per pixel on the sky, huge pixels. So often there are multiple stars contributing light to every pixel in the data set. And a common problem could be to extract the light curve for a star to see some variability and to assume that that comes from the star that you try to extract the light curve for, when it's really variability of one of the contaminant sources that is also contributing light to that aperture. So with a PhD student at Duke University who I started working with when he was an undergrad at UW, led a project developing a software tool that will allow you to precisely pinpoint the location of the signals that you measure from the light curve in the pixel data. I'm not going to go into too much detail about that, how that works, but what it can do is magically disappear the light from the other sources that are not the source of the variability, and give you a distribution of light from the variable source, which you can fit with a model of how light should be distributed across the test pixels to pinpoint the location on the sky where those signals are coming from. You just have to provide the pixel data and the frequencies that you measured from the light curve, and it'll tell you where that came from. It can measure the location of the source to a precision about 1/10 of a pixel, and it shows us clearly it's this little coming from this Gaia source marked in white underneath the X that marks the spot of best fit, and not from this other very nearby Gaia source. It's within a pixel of it. Okay, an important consequence of this, one study with TESS was extracted a bunch of light curves for supergiants and claimed that those yellow supergiants are rapidly pulsating. We took a look at this data set and found that when we apply our TESS localized tool to this, in every case that we can localize a signal that was claimed for these pulsating supergiants, the signal came from a different source. So if you think that fast yellow pulsating supergiants are a real class of pulsating star, I think that the evidence leans against that right now. And this is a cautionary tale on why you should be very careful about where your signals are coming from. These systems were in the Large and Small Magellanic Clouds you can see how many contaminant sources are present in these regions of the sky. Okay, this is the light curve I was showing you earlier. Oh, sorry, this is the periodogram for the star that I was showing you earlier, but I've changed the axis to show period instead of frequency on the x-axis, so it's just the inverse. And what I want to highlight there is that there's some repeating structure in these independent modes, which are marked with the diamonds, that gravity mode oscillations tend to follow an even period spacing with successive radial overtone. And that mean period spacing is a relatively easy to measure asteroseismic observation from a light curve. And we can fit a line to this, and we can derive a conservative uncertainty on the mean period spacing for an individual star. And that's something that we could compare with models. So my collaborator, Agnes Bischoff-Kim, has computed a grid of pulsating white dwarf models in the helium atmosphere instability strip. It's pretty coarse. It steps through these ranges of temperatures and mass with pretty large steps. It's a high dimensional problem. And so this is a huge number of models still, even if it's coarse in each individual case. It parameterizes the oxygen profile within the core with a few different parameters based on how far out to go from the core before the amount of oxygen changes. And we can compare for a particular point in effective temperature and mass, we can look at what kind of mean period spacings we might expect as regardless of what the interior structure looks like. We can generate models with a large range of possibly reasonable interior structures and see that a star with this temperature and this mass could have a distribution of mean period spacings, but a very specific range of mean period spacings. We could fit a Gaussian into that. It's not very good. And we could compare that to our measurements from the observations, and we could ask, does this agree or not with an object that has these global parameters? As we do this for all of the different points in the grid, which are represented by these cyan dots, we see that something great about the mean period spacing is that it varies smoothly and monotonically across this parameter space of mass and effective temperature. So we can pretty reliably interpolate between the values that we find even at these coarse grid points for this particular parameter. We couldn't do that for the individual pulsation modes, but we can do it for the mean period spacing. If we compare it to the measurement we made, we know that our star is going to fall along this swath of agreement between the measurement and the models. We could do something similar with the absolute G-band magnitude is the Gaia magnitude. Gaia has given us great measurements of the parallax for these systems, so we can look for a particular effective temperature and mass that corresponds to also a range of possible radii as we change the interior structure details. And we can convert that into a range of absolute G-band magnitudes, and we can compare that to the measurement. We can characterize that with the Gaussian and compare that to the absolute G-band magnitude. Okay, it does not agree with this effective temperature and mass, but we can do it through the whole range of effective temperature and mass. Here I'm including the effect of kind of our uncertainty on extinction. These vary monotonically across the grid as well and smoothly, and so we can interpolate this also. And we can get a very fine constraint on where the absolute value, absolute magnitude of our star places this in parameter space. And these contours traverse the parameter space in the opposing direction of the mean period spacing contours. So we can combine these in a likelihood estimation to really pin down pretty precisely what the mass and effective temperatures of this star should be to agree with the mean period spacing, to agree with the absolute magnitude, marginalizing over an entire range of reasonable interior structures. And if I marginalize this along each of the axes, we can get a distribution which tells us that we might be able to pin down the effective temperatures here to about 600 Kelvin, and the mass is very precisely to order of hundredths of a mass. This is independent of spectroscopy. So it doesn't have those systematic issues that affect how we determine these properties for most white dwarf stars. And this gives us an independent check that could help us calibrate these values. Yes, Simon? Yeah. We just calculate based on these. We characterize the distribution here as a Gaussian, as a fit to the histogram. We're working on possibly better representations of what this distribution looks like. It's not always Gaussian, and we compare. We just calculate the likelihood of agreement with our measurement, with also treated as having a Gaussian error on both of these parameters. Each of these points has a different distribution of absolute G-band magnitudes and mean period spacings, and we calculate. It's just like the basically how many sigma away it is in each of these dimensions converted to a likelihood. So yeah, so this is something I'm working on. This is sort of the first star we've been applying it to because it was such a nice example. This helium atmosphere white dwarf. We analyzed this star initially as part of a first light paper from a TESS Asteroseismic Science Consortium working group on pulsating white dwarfs because it was the best example from the first few sectors of TESS of a white dwarf that had a clear set of overtones with a mean period spacing we could measure very precisely. So the reason that this is so useful is we can measure independent of spectroscopy mass and effective temperature, which we could compare to the spectroscopic results to see whether to see how large the systematics could be in those analyses. We could also and then the spectroscopic method is applicable to white dwarfs through the full range of temperatures, not just these ones in these very narrow temperature ranges where they pulsate. We can incorporate priors into this. If we right now I'm just treating any interior structure within a range that I think is reasonable as equally likely, but we may want to weight these appropriately to to what we expect to be more likely. Thinking about how we could parameterize these contours and package this up as a function that you could pass your measurements into, and it just gives you an answer. So I think we could. This is a very low dimensional representation of a very high dimensional model grid that you don't need to download all this huge set of models to use. And it narrows down the grid volume considerably to where you may be able to then within this region calculate a much finer grid of models to resolve, to get a good fit that agrees to within with the measured individual pulsation periods to resolve the structure of the star. Hopefully, this is still the big goal of white dwarf asteroseismology, and I'm hoping that this approach will lead to a breakthrough in our ability to find the correct model that represents the star, and we can really infer the interior structure of these objects. So one more thing I want to share. This is the periodogram that I showed previously of this star. The best example, the one we wrote up as our golden example of a pulsating white dwarf in TESS. It was been reobserved in sector 30. And this is what it looks like. Extremely different. This main signal amplitude has doubled. It has shifted in frequency by a significant amount to be 1 microhertz lower than it was before. That's about 1,000 sigma difference. There are all these harmonics present that weren't all there before. They've increased in their relative amplitudes. showing that the nonlinear behavior in response to the pulsations has increased. The other pulsations that were here, they're gone now for the most part. This might be one, but for the most part, they're gone. And this is what's really weird, is that there are these little peaks to the left of each of the harmonics of this main mode. They represent some sort of amplitude modulation to these signals that's taking place. I've never seen anything like this in looking at hundreds of pulsating white dwarf light curves. Very curious about what's happening here. My group's working on sorting through this. What seems to have happened is that this main mode has just continued to grow in amplitude as it's driven, and as it's grown in amplitude, I don't know, maybe the convection zone is responding to this high amplitude pulsation. It's actually affected the structure of the star if this resonant frequency is shifted by an entire microhertz lower. And so maybe these other modes, these are no longer resonant within the star, so they've died off. What is happening with this amplitude modulation? We're not quite there yet with our modeling attempts, but it could be that this amplitude is becoming so large that it's getting close to, or maybe even is, completely removing the convection zone at certain locations. We have a good fit to this with a nonlinear light curve model that shows that it's an L equals 1, M equals 0 mode, where the top and bottom of the star are oscillating most extremely. And as this amplitude gets larger and the convection zone gets thinner when you're locally hotter, we could be getting to the point where the convection zone is actually completely going away, and that affects your ability for the amplitude to be any larger, and that could be causing this some sort of mode modulation of the observed amplitude. Those are my leading thoughts on this, but I'm very open to your thoughts because this is quite a puzzle. This is not like anything we've seen before in pulsating white dwarfs. Thank you all.
Thank you. We have time for a couple of questions. Let's start with Mathieu.
Hi, thanks. Well, I guess I'll ask one question. The starting was better explained by higher oxygen abundance. Do you know what rate of the C12 alpha gamma was used in the models, and how much you would lower the rate to get that oxygen abundance?
I'm not sure. I'm not really super. I don't have a deep understanding of the modeling of this, but I understand in response to this. This is an interesting case, and I can share a little bit more about this. Let's see, where is it? Way back. Okay. Previous models before this measurement that claimed the oxygen abundance was very high had not produced models with this level of an oxygen abundance. But the team that found this result has been able to create models of white dwarfs that do have this oxygen abundance. I don't know what exactly they had to do to produce those models. Some extra thermal pulses or something, late thermal pulses. I'm not sure exactly. I'm not a theorist. You know, I don't follow the details very well. But they have been able to reproduce this since. They also have applied this method to 3 other hydrogen atmosphere pulsating white dwarf stars, and they find radius constraints for those that do agree with the Gaia constraint. I've been in contact with them. They're not super happy that I published this. So they haven't been super friendly about like collaborating with me on exploring the cause of this discrepancy. Unfortunately, their claim is that, okay, 1 out of 5 of their models doesn't agree, but 4 out of 5 should mean like we should really have faith in this method. I think radius is really the only one of the many parameters in their model that we have a way to externally constrain and compare. So if the method is able to find a solution that gets the radius wrong in one case, then it could find solutions that get a radius that does agree with the Gaia constraints, but gets interior structure details wrong in other cases. And so I think this is a real demonstration that the methodology is capable of finding incorrect solutions. But for the record, they do not agree with me on that.
All right, Julianne was next.
So you showed the really cool results in trying to actually constrain a bunch of interior stuff with the models.
Yeah.
Like that end state of the white dwarf is like the sum total of a lot of evolution, a lot of physics that's internal to the white dwarf. Do you have a sense about, like, as you improve those constraints, is there one part of the stellar evolution or the internal physics of the white dwarf that you think is particularly sensitive to? Like, as you get those constraints, which knobs do you think you get a better handle on later?
Well, let's see. Wait a minute, I passed it. Okay, well, these are the parameters that we're sensitive to. We're sensitive to where the structural profile makes sharp changes or sharp transitions between composition, because these produce features in the Brundt-Weissler frequency that modes, they prefer to have nodes close to, if that makes sense. There's a mean period spacing in general, but there's a modulation to the spacing that gives you sensitivity to the amount of hydrogen and helium and the central abundance of oxygen. These are the things that we can measure most directly. I'm not really sure what physics of the evolution this most constrains. This is sort of my very observer focused view of this. But we try to use evolution. These models are not produced by evolution. These are fully parameterized structures. So they're not necessarily what we expect. We could ask for a model that doesn't represent what we expect evolution to produce. That's what the Nature paper results sort of showed as well. But we try to use what we expect from stellar evolution models to figure out what the range of parameters to explore is, and maybe apply some priors on these. And perhaps we will find something that tells us that we need to change the physics in the models. But I'm not even close to that yet. So I haven't thought that far along.
So those, going back to, I guess, your first, those outpours that you showed. So what is the delta magnitude, and do we expect to see how we see them outside of the instability district? Can we see them from the ground?
Yeah.
Is this something? How can we explain that? I mean, that's scary to see a white dwarf doing that.
Yeah, we do have some models for what this is. So as we found this in more examples, our model that seems to describe pretty much all of the observational aspects of this behavior is that and this has been described theoretically for pulsating stars for some time, is that there could be a parametric resonance within a star where you have two pulsating modes with let's see, you have a pulsation mode whose frequency is very close to the sum of two other mode frequencies in the star. And that relationship, that near resonance, can cause, if the pulsation amplitude grows large enough, it can transfer its energy into the two other modes in the star, which for having each much lower frequencies, these may not be driven within the star. They may be globally damped within the star. And so this could be a mechanism by which an outburst happens, it disrupts the pulsations grow back in. Eventually they grow to the amplitude where they can trigger this resonance again. That pulsational energy goes into heating the photosphere, and so we see this increase in brightness. And that heat that goes into the star also thins the convection zone. The convection zone has the effect of reducing the observed amplitude of the modes that are trapped deeper in the star. So during the outburst, when the star gets brighter because it's hotter, it also has a thinner convection zone, which causes the pulsation signals that are deep within the star to be observed with a much larger amplitude. And having looked at this for many stars, we have examples both hydrogen and helium atmosphere outbursting stars. Actually, the very first one was probably observed in 1996, GD358. There was this event during a whole Earth telescope campaign. Before we had Kepler, if you wanted a really long light curve, you had to coordinate with a bunch of telescopes all at different longitudes, so that as it became daytime somewhere, someone picked up your observations at a different observatory, you get a multi-day light curve. And in one of these examples, one of the light curves one day kind of looked like this. The star was brighter, it had way bigger oscillations. At the time, they called it a sforzando. They didn't know what it was. Some people called it a whoopsie, like the stars just go, whoops. I mean, really had no idea what caused this. I mean, the difference here is like 15%. So I don't know, convert that to magnitude. So in hindsight, that was probably what we were observing. We just didn't have the context to put this in, and we may have observed this from the ground as well. But because we think we know what we're interested in, we think white dwarfs pulsate with periods of 2 to 20 minutes. In our field, we would follow a star all night long from the ground. I spent over 200 nights doing this during my PhD. Just observe a star from horizon to horizon, get as much data as you can. And then there's this big air mass effect, these color effects. We just fit a low order polynomial through that and flatten it out because we're not interested in things on timescales longer than a half an hour. So we may have examples where this has been observed from the ground, but because we didn't know that this behavior should exist, we just flattened it out and ignored it. So that's how this new data set really was able to reveal this clearly.